Hi everyone, my name is Claudia Del Prado. I work at Fabernovel, an innovation agency based in Paris. So we have offices in other locations like Shanghai, San Francisco, Lisbon, and others. And I'm really happy to be here today talking about design and about how we have included our sustainability approach in the way we do design, let's say. And that's the first thing, is that this methodology and this way of doing design, we've called it impact by design, because the idea behind it is that impact is a part of how we do design, and we're going to take it into account from a global perspective. I will tell you more about this later. So the first thing that I would like to start with is, I think it's interesting to tell you about our whole story of how we arrived to our methodology that we actually use today when we, as I said, implement this impact by design approach. And Fabernovel, like any other company, and especially as we work in innovation, it's been a while. We've started asking ourselves all these questions, that how, in the end, what does it mean to have a positive impact? How do we need, and why do we need to talk about it and think about it? How do you measure it? How can we align impact and business? Or, how can we innovate in a world where we know that we have to take into account this sustainability or impact approach? These are some of the just of the few not easy questions that we ask ourselves. And actually, this is what we're saying, no? Like especially in the digital world, we keep on innovating and creating new things, launching new apps, adapting this new functionality, more and more things. And the question we ask ourselves is it really for the better? Have we become addicted to innovation, or is there a sense in all of this? Especially, does innovation mean progress? Actually, it doesn't, not always, right? We really think that innovation without intention doesn't make sense. And that this is why I really like this image. This brings us back to the essence of what design means, which, as we know, design means creating with an intention. So this big question of how do we cross the river? Let's ask ourselves, every time we create, every time we innovate, what is the objective we put behind this? It's not a question of just creating bridges all the time, but like waiting for a minute and just asking ourselves the questions, why are we doing this? What is the problem we're trying to solve? Obviously, we're not the first ones to talk about this. We have all the solutionist theories, etc. And we really believe that this is the way to tackle things, and that this starts obviously by stop thinking only user-centric and start thinking ecosystem or stakeholder-centric. So from this user-centricity obsession to how can we design for the human, for society, and for the planet, so thinking about all the stakeholders that interact. And this is good news, because as we showed in a recent study that we published about impact is a driver of value creation and company performance. And we have a lot of examples. I can send you the link of the study if you're interested, on how impact today drives value creation, and the investments search more and more these kind of decisions made. So, okay, all this is wonderful. Till here, I imagine what you're all telling yourself is like, okay, this is great. We all want to design with this impact approach. We all want to be good people and make a better world. But how do we actually do it? No, because this is the whole kit of the question, and this is why we say like design is the problem, but also we believe it's the solution. We believe we can do things differently, but how? Because, and I always like to show this trilemma that most of the devs that we have in-house tell us, that many clients ask them, I want this website or this product delivered fast, good, the best quality, and cheap. And I want it now, and I want it to be the best, and I want it to be really, really cheap. And this is not possible. In the end, we need to make a choice. If it's faster, maybe it's not going to be so good. and maybe it's going to be more expensive. And I mean, it's like, for instance, right now, all the many governments, due to the sanitary crisis, they're imposing lockdowns, and we can, I mean, they make decisions based on what is the sanitary impact for the population, the social and the economical. And I mean, you have to play with the three variables and say, okay, I'm going to make a lockdown of just 3 weeks or maybe 4, and then I know the health impact is going to be more positive, but then economic negative. This kind of decision making where different variables interact. And we believe it's the same. Oops, I went too fast. Companies today, when they're making strategic decisions, they are confronted with this kind of decision-making processes. Like, we want to make a decision, launch a new product, a new service, which is super good for the company, cash, etc. But what is my impact on society and on the planet? How can we do it so that we consider all the variables and we create the maximum valuable possible for all of them? But always thinking that it has to be a decision process where the variables are correlated, because they actually are, not every variable on their own. And this is really important. And this is why in the beginning I talked about impact by design and making impact part of this global approach, where you don't think about cash on one side or on another side of environmental value. You should think about how to, or we believe that to create a maximum value for everyone, every stakeholder, the decision process should involve from the beginning all the variables. And this is why we talk about distributing value and approaching value creation from a balanced perspective, and not so much from a maximizing point of view perspective, because the truth is that we've realized that this thing of linear maximum value creation is an illusion, and it's not real. I mean, many of these variables are today in tension, and actually we realize that if, for instance, we launch this new super app that is wonderful for the company and it's going to create a lot of value for my EBITDA or whatever, maybe the impact on the planet is not so good, and maybe so it's more a question of how you distribute this value more than how you maximize all of the variables. And in the end, it's this idea of saying that the value creation is limited and that we're going to have to find a way to distribute it amongst all these different variables. And this, for designers, must ring a bell, because it's really, and I love this metaphor, it's really in line with the Bauhaus movement, which is, in the end, was this idea of balance. No? How do we find a balance between beautiful and useful, and design and technology? Because in the end, the balance will give us the solution and will create more value for all the stakeholders involved, because there's not an optimal, ideal solution for everyone. It will have to be a balanced solution. So, well, this is why we talk about impact by design, because we believe that design is the perfect mindset and tool to optimize this value distribution amongst all the stakeholders of an ecosystem. And this is why we try to insert impact when we do design, in all our methodologies and in all the projects we do. And today I'm going to tell you about 2 different frameworks that we've developed in Fabernovel, and that we're now applying in projects with our clients to let's say, include this approach. The first one is a more strategic framework. It's called the value wheel. I'll tell you about it in a minute, but it's more from a strategic decision-making position. And the second one is the impact by design journey canvas, which many of you here probably know, because last year, during the Digital Sobriety Challenge for Apidays, we had the chance to use this journey canvas with the different teams and companies that were there, and was much appreciated. Actually, Maria Jose from Orange has just talked about it. So, I will get back to them soon, but I would like to start with the value wheel, because it's it's a higher perspective framework, more on a strategic macro level. And what is the value wheel? So the value wheel is a tool, a framework that we've developed to, let's say, to make actionable all of this theory I've told you about value creation and how we want to integrate a systemic value creation approach when we make strategic decisions and when we launch new services and new projects. So it's a tool that enables this kind of decision making with a systemic value creation approach. The idea of the wheel, of the value wheel, it looks like this. It's composed of 3 different dimensions. The first one is the value creation targets. So here we define them as society, the planet, and the company. The second dimension are the value creation variables. So in the end, what do we put into each of the targets? How are we going to create value for society, for the planet, or for the company? And the third level or dimension is the associated KPIs that are going to help us to concretize and also measure in the end these variables. And yeah, many of you will probably recognize this shape because of the value wheel, because we've inspired ourselves on Kate Raworth's donut. It's not the same kind of tool, but she also, I mean, for those that don't know her, Kate Raworth is a British economist, and she created the donut, donut economics, where basically she talks about an alternative system, an alternative way of seeing capitalism, and not, the donut is like a framework to illustrate what it would mean to thrive in a city. So she sees it more from a, like, let's say, public perspective, and how we need to make policies. So it's a tool that serves policy making, not thinking about maximizing growth, linear growth all the time, but about meeting some social demands that are in the center and in some planetary boundaries. So we took the donut and we adapted it to what we call this value wheel, which also has the limits. But for us, those limits are not planetary boundaries. They're more limits, which mean that, there's so much value that you can create when you're a company. And the question is, how are you going to distribute it amongst all the different variables and all the possibilities you have in order to create what we believe is a resilient company and long-lasting value, which would be that company that manages to distribute value in the most balanced way possible amongst all the variables. And as I said, there are many, many ways we can imagine to apply and use this framework. But here are, I just noted 2. The first one is to define the will. So make the strategic reflection with a company to just think about how can we, what is my value wheel when I'm a company? Who do I want to create value for? How will I do it? What are my objectives? And the second one, that is play with the wheel, and we're going to see it in a minute, which is thinking about business cases or new services and how will these create value. Important is to say, before I go on to the example, that what is interesting here is that every company has its own wheel, and this is the work we do with our clients. We believe that all companies have a value. Obviously, it's not that they exist to create value for who depends on their context. All of the companies need to create value for themselves to exist, but then their stakeholders will be very different if it's a mobility company or if it's a pharma company or whatever. So that's why we do obviously the part of the exercise is to adapt the wheel to your company in question. So for instance, here we did the exercise of applying it for Tesla. So what would Tesla's value wheel look like? No, and for Tesla, we identified three targets, which are the planet, the mobility ecosystem, and Tesla. And we did the exercise of defining all the variables and the different KPIs and KPIs. What is interesting here is that when we've done this exercise with companies and with some of our clients, it's a really strategic exercise, because in the end, it's a new way of approaching, as I said, your strategic plans. So you're not going to think only about budget, and you're going to think about how I'm going to allocate my budget but where do I want to create value and how? This is what is interesting in this exercise. And actually, if we do the second type of exercise, which I said before, which is play the wheel, here the idea is to say, okay, I'm going to think about 3 different business cases that I want to launch, for instance, or I'm thinking about, for instance, for Tesla, the 3 strategic business cases were like, let's continue business as usual. So I'm Tesla, I continue to sell individual cars. What if I launched Tesla Light, which means new lighter and collective vehicles? Or what if, third option, I created an actual mobility platform, which is completely changing the business model of Tesla now, because it will be a software service. So the idea was to say, okay, now we've defined our value wheel for Tesla. What are the value profiles of each of these business cases? How are they creating value and for who? So the first one creates a lot of value for Tesla, as we see, because it's their business model right now, but it doesn't create that much value for the planet, and it doesn't create nearly at all value for the mobility ecosystem. The second option is more balanced, and the third option is more. And the idea is that every time we play the wheel, there's this conviction that I said in the beginning, which enters, and it's really important, that value creation is limited. So you can't create a maximum value for all the variables. It's impossible, because the variables are intentional. For instance, the first business model, business as usual, creates more cash for Tesla, but it creates less value for the mobility ecosystem. So we always have to play with this trade-off. And as I said, every company has its own wheel. So what about you? What about your company or the company who you work in? If we had to define the wheel for them, what would it look like, and how would we approach value creation from this perspective? And now, and I know I see the time running, I'm going to talk to you about the other impact by design framework we've been working on, which has, obviously it has a lot to do with the value wheel, but it's a total different perspective. Here, this framework is really meant to be used from an operational level. So it's a journey canvas. How do we, once we have a service or a product that is already launched, or at least we really have all the journey defined and all the steps, how do we integrate a positive impact approach once we've already set up? So the wheel will be more, as I said, a strategic level framework, a framework you use when you're thinking about launching a new service, a new business model, etc. And you want to obviously have a strategic thought before that. And this is, once we already have it at an operational level, how can we really insert an impact approach to improve some of the points that could be pain points from an environmental perspective. So this, as I said, this framework has been used. We've already used it with different companies, and we had the chance to use it during the Digital Sustainability Challenge, and it was really much appreciated. So we would like to thank once again all the groups that were involved, because it was a super opportunity for us to work with different companies, and we learned a lot. So it's composed on 2 workshops. The first one is a really easy workshop of what we call Vision 360. In the end, it's just the idea of this workshop is just to fill in the value. To pose the value proposition of the project or the product or the service. What are the users? What are the users' needs? And what's the company's objective with this project? To then put all the steps of the journey, fix what are the associated equipment for each step, and what are the stakeholders. So what is interesting here is really to divide your product and service in different steps, and to associate the equipment step by step and the stakeholders. So this is really a just 360 vision workshop, 30 minutes. And once we did this, it's the second part of the exercise, which is the interesting part, let's say, although the first one is really important as well, which is what we call the challenges. And here the challenge will be to with the journey you've already defined with the associated equipments and the stakeholders, define step by step what are the environmental pain points, step by step. So it's a really micro level. And once you've had them, what are the possible actions or opportunities that you can find? And the result is that we realize that in every environmental pain point, there's an opportunity. What does an opportunity mean? There's a way of doing things differently, which makes, doing things differently, having a positive impact on the environment, or at least reducing the negative impact. For instance, instead of putting a video in that step, I decide to just put a phone number and the user can phone me instead of putting an explicative video. I just said this example like that, but there are many to imagine. And with the groups, we saw that it was a really good way of really mapping like all the possible impacts and how to improve them. And actually, as I said in the beginning, when Maria Jose just presented how her team used this framework and how it worked. And we were really happy to hear her positive feedback about it and to see that it was useful. Because in the end, that's the objective of all the frameworks we developed, to have the opportunity to work with other companies and entrepreneurs to help them integrate this vision of how design can be part of the solution and how we can integrate impact from a global approach to make our projects more sustainable. And this is the end. Thank you very much for your time, and I loved talking here today. And please get in touch if you're interested. I would love to continue discussing about all these themes that, as you could probably see, passionate me. And obviously to continue developing new things that integrate impact by design. Thank you very much and good afternoon.